Don't you love it when the weirdnesses happen? Okay, going live here. Start. Okay. 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 Welcome 2023. Live office hours 2023. Took me a hot second to get things bitten along. So annoying. It's fine. 2023. Here we go. Here we go. Just about got a little over enthusiastic there about like drinking my. It's actually water, but it's tea flavored because I poured the water in when I still had this much left tea. This much left tea. This much tea left in the bottom, so of the cup. So sort of like tea flavored water. Delicious. You're welcome. Oh, and I have a little chip in my. Doop, doop. There we go. Boop. All right. Let's get bitten. Let's get bitten. Here we go. Whew. Live office hours. Hello. Welcome. Welcome to Live Office Hours with me, your host, Dr. Shannon Coates. Up here in, my pronouns are she, they, and I am up here in a little town north of Toronto. Toronto, for those of you who are wondering if I was actually Canadian or not, but here we go. So north of Toronto. I'm actually from Ontario. You can tell by the way I say Toronto. North of Toronto, a little suburb. And these are the, I am grateful to live and work on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, and the Wendat Neo-Wentzio peoples. So, 2023, here we go. Here we go. What are we talking about today? Talking about meaningful consent in the voice studio. Meaningful consent. Meaningful consent for touching in the voice studio. And part of the reason that I wanted to kind of come back to this, I've done a few, I've gone online a few times to talk about consent and touching in the voice studio. I made a controversial post a while back about, if you think that your pedagogy, I was feeling spicy. And I said something like, if you think that your pedagogy must include touching in order to be effective, then you have bad pedagogy. So that was maybe a little bit farther than I normally go, and also a little bit ouchy. And so there's that. I still do believe that in a sense. I just don't, I'm not going to be the person who says you have bad pedagogy necessarily. And also, it's not necessarily bad pedagogy, it's just like ineffective or perhaps not as effective as it could be, right? Let's put it that way instead. Here we go. So, what's this thing about meaningful consent? And so I put up a post at the beginning of January, which, how are we in the middle of January? Put up a post about the things that I'm bringing with me into 2023 that, just like concepts and things. And one of those concepts was, due to the power differential in the voice studio, meaningful consent is nearly impossible to, meaningful consent is nearly impossible. And so a couple of people asked me about that. And a couple of people sort of pointed that out and asked for further clarification about that. So I thought, you know what, that would be a good topic to start off the whole shebang, to start our live office hours with this year. So that's why I'm doing that topic. So what do I mean by meaningful consent? Meaningful consent, as you likely know, meaning when we're in a relationship, any relationship, meaning both partners in the relationship or both people in the relationship are on board with what is happening in the relationship. So we're both on board with, and especially in a physical sense, so we're both on board with what we're doing, where we are, and we're talking about meaningful ongoing, enthusiastic consent when we're talking about romantic partners or sexual partners. So we're talking about what does it mean to have meaningful ongoing consent in a relationship like that. And so what does it mean to have what does it mean to have meaningful consent? And that means ongoing and enthusiastic agreement from both parties or from all parties about what is happening physically. And what is assumed in the consent relationship or within the relationship where there is meaningful consent, what is assumed is that all people in the relationship are on an equal power basis. So everyone who's in the relationship, everyone who is giving consent, everyone who is participating, in order for the consent to be meaningful, everyone has to be on the same or close to the same power amount, right? They have to have they have to be at approximately the same level in terms of power in the relationship. And so when we talk about the voice studio, when we're acquiring consent in the voice studio, that applies as well. So meaningful consent means for touching, for manipulation of someone else's body, requires that both parties, and I'm going to say both parties now because we're talking probably about a one-on-one relationship in the voice studio, both parties need to be at the same or similar level of power and have to have the same level of agency in the voice studio in order for the consent to touch to be meaningful. And this is nearly impossible to achieve in the voice studio. Why is it nearly impossible to achieve? Well, first of all, there is the teacher-student relationship, which is necessarily in the vast majority of a teaching, mentoring type of relationship. There is necessarily a power differential there because someone is coming to you for information, for consulting, for coaching, for learning, for et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then someone is coming into the relationship because they want information, they want coaching, they want to learn. And someone is coming into the relationship having that information. And I am saying this in a very how shall I say, traditional teacher-student relationship, right? Even when we have very intentionally created a transformational, thank you Liz Jackson Hearns, a transformational relationship in the voice studio, even when we have been very intentional about lowering that power differential, there is still a power differential. There is always going to be a power differential at some level in a teacher-student relationship, in a learning relationship. There is always going to be a power differential. And that is especially true if I, as the teacher, am older than the student. So, that is especially true as the teacher. It is also especially true if I am part of the dominant culture, or the culture that has traditionally had more power or has more power, right? So in the structure culturally, if I am a white person, if I'm an English speaker in North America and Western Europe, if I'm an English speaker, if I as a first language, as my first language, if I am educated, meaning if I have degrees or et cetera, et cetera. If I am tall, that is there is an inferred power differential in our culture around tallness, where people who are taller have this automatic authority. It's fascinating. Anyway, that is one of the things. If you're male, if we are cisgender, if we're neurotypical, if we are able-bodied, if we are, all of those things give us or make us part of the dominant culture and infer power even if we're working with someone who also has all of those things, right? Even if we're working with someone who also has all of those same power privileges. Privileges? Sure, let's say that. So even if I'm working with a tall, white, English speaking, blah, 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 all the things person, there is still a power differential between me and the person I'm working with because I'm in the teacher, mentor, coach, etc. role. So that role, oh, hey, Rebecca. Yes, 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 yes. Yeah, Rebecca, I want to just read that out because you're saying my college students and I learn together. Absolutely. And you have intentionally changed the power dynamic to reflect the shared learning experience. Absolutely. And I think even when we have done that work to make sure that we're working in such a way that there is as little power differential as possible, it is still there, especially in a college situation, right? It's a great reminder that there is no way to remove the power dynamic entirely. So like, especially in a college situation, folks in an academic setting are very much primed, if you will, to see thank you, Christy. Good morning. To see their instructors as having the thing they need. And so they're in the lower power dynamic. I mean, there's also an age, an age difference as well. There are other things happening as well. But so that is a power dynamic that we, even when we are intentional about creating as much of a cooperative learning experience as possible and acknowledging, et cetera, there is still a power dynamic difference there. There's still going to be a difference. So, like I talk to people all the time who are like, well, I always get consent. I never touch unless I have consent. I always ask. Okay. Okay. But if you are in the power, you are in the power position in the relationship, that is not meaningful consent. It just is not, because they are not on the equal level as we are in our role as the teacher in the situation. Again, especially in an academic situation, and especially when we're talking about folks who are younger than we are, so children, obviously. And you can't get consent to touch children from their parents, friends. That's the other thing. Well, I always ask their mom whether it's okay if I put my hand on their stomach so that I can, I always ask the mom, or I always ask the parent. You can't get permission from the parent. You can't get consent. That is not the way consent works. That's not the way meaningful consent works, right? The consent has to be between me and the person has to be on the same power level as I am. And a child is never going to be on the same power level as I am. And their parent cannot give you consent on their behalf. That is not the way consent works, right? No, it's not a thing. So, and the other place that this happens often is, in master classes, especially in Western classical settings, right? This happens in master classes all the time, where you've got the big, you've got the masterclass teacher coming in, and you're in front of an audience, and you may have the most agency-filled singer, mature singer, who has lots and lots of agency and knows themselves on stage there. Is that singer even the one with the most agency? Is that singer? How much courage does it take to say to the masterclass technician in front of the entire audience, no, don't touch me? How much courage does that take? Right? That takes a lot of courage. And it takes, especially if you have a cultural conditioning to acquiesce and to please and to do the thing that will get you out of danger the fastest, right? So if I am right? So if I have been socialized female, and I'm going to speak to my experience, but this is also doubly, triply so if you are a neurodivergent person, if you are a person of color in in a Western society, if you are a disabled person, like all of these other intersections come into play too. I know that as a person who has been socialized, yes, Eden says, woo, I have seen masterclass technicians who are way too handsy. Yeah, I mean, there's no level of good handsy as far as I'm concerned, right? I don't in master classes, I don't think there's a level of good handsy at all, right? I don't think that exists. In a masterclass situation, I don't think it exists. So as a person who is socialized female, socialized as a woman in this Western society, and I'm a pretty strong person, but I was socialized to acquiesce. I was socialized to do the thing that's going to get me out of the situation. And I can use humor very, very effectively and charm very effectively to get myself out of a situation of potential danger. Absolutely. And so in a masterclass situation, though, where a masterclass teacher, asks and says, "Oh, do you mind if I put my hand on your blah 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 and you do the thing?" I can get out of it. I can say like, "Oh, no, thank you," or whatever, right? I can be charming. I can get out of it, but I shouldn't have to do it in the first place. I shouldn't have to feel the pressure to do that in the first place. The other thing. Yeah, Christy says, I'm reminded of an appointment with my son's pediatrician when she looked him in the eyes, explained consent in amazing 5-year-old language, and explained what and why she was touching him. It was an amazing learning moment for me and a reminder of all of these dynamics. Yes, yes. Some people do this very, very well. The learning just kind of stops for us when the touch begins. Yes. So this is also another thing, right, you're very welcome. This is another component as well where, yes, where we have, elaborate, Chrissy, yeah, where we have, sorry, ooh, got a little, yes, so as a person who was socialized female, my response to anyone in authority, anyone who I perceive as having authority or more power than I do in the situation, and again, I have quite a bit of power just because of who I am and all that stuff. But anybody who has, the less and less power sensation compounds, the more the more there are intersections of non-dominant and of cultural non-dominance, right? So the more and more. Oh yeah. Thanks, Christy. So the whole, when we're in a public forum, when there is a masterclass situation, and then asking for consent, there is no, we're not on a level playing field. And let's take it back to when we are in a voice studio and we are asking for consent. As voice teachers, we know that our intentions are good. We know our intentions are good. I just want them to learn more, right? I'm going to talk about those of us who do have good intentions, because sometimes folks don't have good intentions, and so that's another thing. But we know that our intentions are good. But my intention never outweighs the impact of my action. So my intention can be absolutely incredible. My intention can be, we're going to get to this learning, we're going to find this learning so much faster if I just put my hand on your XYZ, or I put my hand on your chest, or whatever, I just do a thing, blah, blah, blah. My intentions can be excellent. And I may be someone who doesn't have a lot of power too, right? So I may be someone who doesn't have as much privilege as I do, for example. And so it feels like my intentions are amazing. However, we do not know what the impact of touching may have. We just don't know. And that then becomes a hijacking, as Eden is saying, the learning kind of stops for us when the touch begins. So if someone has, if there is something going on in the background, if there are things happening, if there have been things happening, around touch and around boundaries. It doesn't even have to be around touch. It can be around boundaries being moved through, pushed through without consent. Like it's all around what my personal agency. If my personal agency has been violated at some point, my touching you, no matter how good my intentions are still going to impact negatively. So that's impact. And that for me, that's enough to say, I'm not going to do this, right? For me, that's enough. But let me also give you a couple of other reasons why meaningful consent is not a thing in the voice studio, and why it's you're going to have a more effective learning in the voice studio if you're not touching. So I did start this off too by saying, I've heard the no touch rule, if you will, framed often as, yes, we can never know the negative effects for individual students. Yeah, we can never know how this is going to affect people. I've totally been integrating no-touch music teaching. I come from a dance and acting world and also teaching sewing where everyone gets handsy for kinesthetic teaching reasons. Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Sarah is saying that they're in so many other worlds, there is a lot of inferred, a lot of expected touching, right? I'm going to talk about that in a minute as well, Sarah. Thank you for bringing that up. So one of the big reasons that this is framed, or often the way that this is framed, is that you should not touch your students because misunderstandings can happen and you may get sued. So you want to avoid getting sued. So let me just unpack that just a little bit. So first of all, if the main reason you are not touching your students is because you're afraid they're going to sue you, they're going to misunderstand and sue you, what does that say about your teaching? That there may be and or what does it say about what you believe about the students? What does it say about what you believe about touch? My goodness. What do you believe about the singers you're working with, about what touch is about? Like, what do you believe if you think that the main reason, some victim blaming there for sure. If you think that the best reason to not touch someone as you're working in a power differential situation is because they may misunderstand your intention and sue you. So if that's the main reason, I invite you to take a think about that. Really just take a think about that. Because if you're afraid that you are going to be misunderstood, that your intentions are going to be misunderstood, I invite you to reframe that your intention is not the problem. The problem is that you are not thinking about impact. That's the problem. You're not thinking about the impact of moving through boundaries. You're not thinking about the impact of allowing for student agency, of not allowing for student agency. You're not thinking about the impact. You're only thinking about, but my intentions are good. How, and if something happens, they misunderstood me. So if they want to sue me, they misunderstood me. Yes, yeah, exactly, Christy's saying too, and that speaks to how potentially dangerous that situation could be for students of that studio, because the teacher is completely, the teacher is ready to blame the impact of their actions on the student misunderstanding their intention. Yeah? So we as the teacher, we are in the power. Yes, and Bethany says, I mostly don't touch students because I never want them to feel scared or weird in any way, right? Yes, Yes, exactly. Understanding the potential impact of touching is the reason, or is a good reason, I think, is a good reason. So let me propose that there is another really good reason. Um, Let me say one thing too about this, actually, too. Folks who have worked with coercive boundary breakers, teachers who are possibly grooming, etc. Um, yeah, Bethany, I'll come to that in just a minute too. So folks who have worked with teachers who are possibly grooming, teachers who absolutely are grooming, teachers who are coercive, teachers who are intentionally breaking boundaries and pushing through boundaries. So singers who have worked with those teachers say all the time, I did some of my best singing when they did XYZ and they were doing this with my arm, or they were behind me with their hands, or they were doing blah, blah, blah. Like I did some of my best singing, but it never belonged to me. The singing never belonged to me. It was always predicated on and belonged to the teacher because it was their hands on my body. It was their movement through my boundaries. It was their influence, and that singing, that outcome, never fully belonged to me. It was never fully mine. Ouch. Yeah, ouch is right. I know. So that is the impact of, especially when we're talking about coercive teaching, when we're talking about grooming, when we're talking about folks who are intentionally, breaking boundaries. Yeah, I know. Seriously, that is the yes. And so there can be, Bethany's saying too, right? When my teachers have touched or asked me to touch them, I found it very helpful. And it can be helpful. I'm not saying that it cannot be helpful. I'm saying there are more effective ways to come to the same end result, and less dangerous ways. So less impactful ways where we are, we don't run the risk of the resulting sound not belonging fully to the student or not belonging fully to the singer, right? There are ways to do this where that don't involve touch, where we have the same outcome, where it's effective learning, where it's deep learning, where we have very long-term learning, etc., in a joyful situation where no boundaries are crossed, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and where the impact then is that I fully own this sound. It is fully mine. It is fully mine, right? So, in my opinion, that's the best reason not to touch. Absolute best reason not to touch. Because then the sound is the experience is fully the student's experience. It's the singer's experience. The sound is fully theirs. Yes, Rebecca, absolutely. Rebecca's saying this also speaks to teaching a student and supporting them as they learn independently, right? And how they have their own effective practice time. Exactly. And the other thing that I wanted to make clear as well is that so often when we have a hands-on aha moment, when we have something that is an aha moment, that is a performance shift. So Lynn Helding talks about this in her book, The Musician's Mind. I've talked about this a little bit with Cindy Dewey when we did the How We Learn 101 classes. Performance shift, right? So a performance shift is not deep learning. Fast learning is not necessarily effective learning, especially when it comes to a motor skill. So the performance shift, that fast learn that we can get when someone manipulates the body. That's what it's actually called, manipulative teaching. When someone moves the body in a specific way or changes something physiologically. Yes, yeah. Yeah, Christy, exactly. So I'll just reframe. Christy says, in my opinion, that while touch can be effective, more intentional creative strategies can be as effective while also inviting students to better understand the how and why behind the achieved success. Exactly right. Yep, same wavelength. Woo! So yes, that fast learning is not necessarily effective learning, right? Deeper learning doesn't, or performance shift does not actually equal a learned behavior, right? It doesn't actually equal a motor skill acquired. Performance shifts are great, don't get me wrong, but they are just that. They're just a little shift. It doesn't mean that I've got a long-term learning now because of that. So a more effective way, and we know this through, let me say a little thing here, maybe a little personal, let's say. So I have been working with a somatic therapist. That's not what she calls herself. That's what I call her because I feel like it's the most, efficient way to like say what she does. I think it gets it across the fastest. So I've been working with a somatic therapist. Basically, what does your body say? What are you, what's happening in your body for a specific thing that was happening in my body. Pelvic area related thing that was happening in my body. And we've been working entirely online. So at first she was in Toronto and it was also, we've been working for a year. So anyway, and now she lives in Europe. And so we have worked entirely online for a year. And the specific issue that I came to her for was effectively cleared up in 2 online sessions. This is stuff that I would have, if I wasn't, I would traditionally go to someone who would do manipulation work, right? So massage, physical therapy, et cetera, et cetera. So traditionally I would go to someone, and I have gone to people, chiropractors, physiotherapists, massage, all that stuff, like osteopathy. I've done lots of alternative stuff, which I love and is all good, and which is all hands-on, right? And manipulate the body and do the things in the body. Those are all wonderful and effective. Do not get me wrong. They are wonderful and effective. And this specific thing, 2 online sessions of her walking through, what does your body say now? What is happening now in your body? All right, let's try this. What's happening now in your body? Literally 2 sessions. So that plus all of the work that so many teachers have done over the pandemic, where what has come to the forefront is like, oh, when I work online with singers, and I'm never touching them online, when I work online with singers, it requires me to support them as they check in. It requires me to support their agency to figure out what's happening in their own bodies. It requires me to teach in a different way because I can't just go in and manipulate the body. I can't just go in and say like, okay, stretch the neck out a little bit more. I can't just go in and like do the things that I might normally do. That would lead to a fast performance shift, but that I might agency, right? But that I might then still be asking for 3 months from now, 4 months from now. I might still be doing these performance shifts or working like manipulating things 4 months from now, 5 months from now. But because I can't actually put my hands through the screen and touch them or have them touch me, yes. And now let's require that of ourselves, right? So many teachers who I've talked to have said, yes, there has been a shift in the way that I teach because I've had to. And what's happened is that singers are actually learning in a different way. And many of them are taking agency because I'm not there to tell them what's happening in their body. And I'm not there to like manipulate their body and change the things in their body. They got to do it themselves. And so I am working now with them. I'm required to work with them and support them as they figure it out for themselves. And I've had to develop different language. I've had to, ask questions in a different way. I've had to say, like, where do you feel that in your body? Okay, let's go with that then, right? I've had to trust what they feel. And I can't tell them because I can't see them necessarily and I can't touch them. So what this means, I think, is that we have been required to change the way that we work with singers because of being online, and also even somatic therapists who work with the body are working effectively online, never touching, effectively. And it requires us to be much better communicators, 100%. So it requires me to, as a teacher, to think through what is the tonal outcome here? What are the possibilities, and how do I ask the questions rather than give the answers, right? That was something that I talked about in the voice ped degree, actually, with one of the teachers I was working with just a couple of days back. How can I, as soon as I want to give the answers, how can I ask the question so that I'm supporting them as they find the answers, rather than me give the answers every time, rather than me get in there and change the thing. Yes, Sarah. That I want to go there in like 2 seconds. So, yes. 3 reasons not to touch in the voice studio. 1, there's very rarely going to be meaningful consent because there's always a power dynamic difference. 1, very rarely going to be that. 2, intention, our good intention is not a good enough reason because impact outweighs intention. So our good intention is not a good enough reason to touch in the voice studio because impact outweighs intention every time. And 3, there are excellent pedagogical reasons to not touch in the voice studio because it means that we have to support students. It requires us to support students as they find their own agency and they figure out what's happening in their own body. Changes the way we teach. Makes us better teachers, I think, and supports deeper learning. So there are good pedagogical reasons. So not touching because I don't want to get sued, that's not a great reason to not touch. I mean, if that's what keeps you not touching, fine, but it's not a great reason to not touch. All right. One exception. Thank you, Christy. One exception here to the things that I'm saying right now is this. There are ways of working with singers and bodies where singers are coming into the studio and learners are coming into the studio knowing already. Yes, exactly, Sarah, exactly. That I think that's a big reason for the trend for intimacy coordinators in theaters, exactly, because they help us to learn how to touch consensually and how to create the safest way for that to work. Exactly right. Yeah. And so that's kind of that's part of the exception when learners are coming into a learning situation where voice teachers have, say, Alexander training. Voice teachers are perhaps also I don't know, a physical therapist. Voice teachers are also perhaps, so when voice teachers or trainers or coaches also have these very, have credentials and training in these sort of touch-based, if you will, modalities. Because in those touch-based modalities, so in Alexander training, in massage training, in therapy, some of those other therapeutic trainings, there is a lot of training around consent as well. I still feel like I could use a lot more asking and how does your body feel, and a lot less assuming about how my body feels from some of my wonderful, wonderful hands-on therapists. I still feel like I would love for you to ask me a little bit more. And rather than assuming what's happening in my body, I would love for you to ask a little bit more. I still feel that with some of my, wonderful folks who, hands-on trainers who I work with. And at the same time, again, that for me, that would be an exception, is when voice teachers in the voice studio, that would be an exception, is when voice teachers have training in these other touch-based modalities, and when the learner comes into the voice studio fully aware of what that will entail. So when the education is such that the learner comes into the voice studio understanding that these are other modalities that may, that may happen in the voice studio, and I will only use these modalities if you are aware of what they are and how they work, and if you're here for that. If you're not here for that, then we sing and there's no touching. So that, for me, that's the exception. And so Sarah, that, as well, is kind of, for me, that's the exception as well, is pedagogical use of physical manipulation in dance and acting and other physical disciplines. So in piano, again, there can be physical manipulation of the hands, right? There can be that, of the fingers and the hands. And so negotiating that, I think, becomes, and in dance, I'm not sure what happens. I'm not sure how to negotiate that in dance. I know some folks who are wonderful dance instructors who maybe I'll do a little ask around about that. But I have a feeling that there is a way as well to do that, because it's the same thing, right? The same thing in dance, in acting, in in any of these other physical things that we do. The learning, that fast learning that we get from being manipulated by someone turning our foot out, or I don't even know, right? Yes, exactly. Christy, I think that is the key, right? Transparent expectations where consent would happen before or at the contract rather than mid-interaction. Absolutely. Transparent consent before, as well as, so like currently in Canada, when you go for a massage, you fill in a consent form. Obviously, you're at the massage therapist, so you are expecting to be touched, right? So you're at the massage therapist, you're expecting to be touched. That is open and transparent. And you fill in a form that has a whole thing. Hey, Melissa, talking about touch in the voice studio. Speaking of, consent and intimacy coordinators. You fill in a form that has that checks off, where you check off the spaces, the places in your body that you do not want to be touched. So you can check off that you do not want to be touched in the buttocks. You can check off that you don't want to be touched in the upper thighs. You can check off you don't want to be touched on the feet. You can check off that you don't want to have your shoulders touched. You can check all of the spaces off, like there's a whole form of consent in advance. So the massage therapist then knows in advance, and you are making decisions in advance, not at the moment of, right? So yeah, that transparency and openness, and that's in massage where we know I'm there to be touched. I'm there because I want to get touched, right? Same in the US. Cool. Yeah, Obviously, I don't know what's happening in the US, but in Canada, that's a relatively recent, I'm going to say in the last 2 or 3 years, that form has come out, but it's a relatively recent change in massage therapy where you give explicit consent for where you want to be touched. I think previously it was more of a like, again, right? In the middle of the interaction where you're like on the table and they're like, do you mind if I do your buttocks? And you're like, I don't actually think I do want that, but oh my gosh, I'm here right now. What? Let's see. So, yes, I think that's the way, Sarah, is with transparency before, and the choices get to be made before. It is possible that those choices can be made in the voice studio as well. What I'm saying is that you can actually make it, it's pedagogically speaking, there's more reason to not touch than to touch. So pedagogically speaking, even if you do have open and transparent consent. All right. Whew. There we go. 3 things. Fear of litigation is not a great reason to not touch in the voice studio. There are excellent reasons not to touch in the voice studio, and fear of litigation is a terrible reason. It's not a good reason. Even though it is often framed that way, right? So it's often framed, well, we don't want to, I mean, even in Musician's Mind, Lynn Helding has a paragraph here about hands off is the title of the paragraph or the section. Oh yeah, Christy, let me talk about that in a minute. And so she starts this paragraph with, before leaving this section on feedback, take a look at the ethical considerations of the physical feedback known as manipulation. This is literally a hands-on teaching approach in which the teacher touches the student's body in order to elicit a physical or tonal response. Even though there can be some remarkable benefits to hands-on guidance, both student and teacher should think soberly about the risks of touching. The potential for misunderstanding, misuse, or outright abuse is high, particularly if there are no witnesses present, which is very often the case in one-on-one studio teaching where student and teacher are alone behind closed doors. So she lists that as the first reason not to touch, right? It's like the primary reason not to touch, or at least it's given primacy in that paragraph. It is the first thing that she says in that paragraph. And like I said, I just don't think that's the best reason. That's a terrible reason. Pushback, I have heard pushback on this. Well, it's the most effective way to get there, right? It's the fastest way to get there. I have had excellent results. I was touched and I loved it and it really worked well for me. Basically all of those kinds of like, but it works. It works really well. And yes, it can work well, but it's a performance shift in the moment that isn't necessarily correlated to a deep learning and is unlikely to be correlated to a deep learning. It is likely that if I shift you in the moment, if I do manipulation in the moment, you may have a performance shift, you may change things, and then I'm still going to have to do that same manipulation 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 more times down the road in order for your body to grasp it as their own. Whereas if we work and take a little bit longer to work through it, where we're drawing attention to the movement and where we're working together to sense what's happening and to have that agency over the movement, that is a deeper learning, and that then becomes something where I don't have to keep continually harping on it. It becomes the thing that I do. Yeah, exactly, Christy. Yes, shock therapy might be effective as well. It's effective in the moment. Really change some things. Exactly right. Yeah, exactly. And that's the other thing too. And the other thing too is that people have had good experiences with being touched themselves and have had performance shifts themselves and things where they felt like, oh yes, I really changed that and really got that concept because the teacher touched me. And my question then would be, how much more deeper would that learning be? How much more agency would you have had over that learning if the teacher had supported you while you learned it on your own without them manipulating you? If you've got it in your body yourself on your own, how much more effective would that have been? how much more long lasting would it have been? How much more, yeah, effective? And also, how much more agency would you have, found for yourself if you had been supported in your learning in that way, rather than having the learning like created for you? Okay. That's all, folks. Let's give it a let's stop there. Have a great weekend, and a great start to 2023. Woo. Take care. Let's end this one too. Ending. I don't think.